I have a very great confession to make. This confession's been precipitated by several meetings over the last week. After the story last week, when it was said, make God real, someone came to me and said, years ago you told me that God was not real, that it was just a figment of my mind, and now you tell me, make God real. And then in a regular meeting I have with a lovely being through the week, she asked me the very pointed question, who are you? And where are you in the scheme of things? And I said to her, I cannot tell you who I am or where I am, but I can tell you what was said to someone who was met the other day. And therein lies my confession. Because what was said to this very beautiful and tortured soul was, you scratch this old woman and you'll find a God-drunken lover. And the next time we meet, we're going to be drunk in God's tavern together. Does that mean that over all of these years that we've been together, and everything that's been said and done is colored by that? Damn sure. Does that make me a fraud? Well, that's for you to judge, and if you think so, you don't have to be here. But effectively, if those stories, so many stories over these years, more than 20 years, and some of us have been together for almost all of that time, these stories have effectively, coming from all persuasions of all kinds, taken away, removed the conditioned beliefs of mind, which created for us a God of the mind, to enable the possibility that we could experience it for ourselves. And then it can be said to each and every one of us, welcome to God's tavern. Be a drunk with me. But if, having arrived at this place, in making this confession to you, and knowing that everything that's been said and done has been colored by that, how could it not? Then you have to go seek elsewhere. But in the meantime, I'll tell you a story anyway. And maybe 2 or 3 stories, in fact, today. And it's a reminder of that old one, and this is not making excuses, but it is an answer that maybe could have been given to the person who questioned last week. You remember that story about the Buddha walking down the road with his disciple Ananda. Now the Buddha's aura is said to be 300 miles wide. And so there was a man coming towards the Buddha, and his effulgence was very evident to him. So this man came up to him, fell down in front of the Buddha and said, I'm Christian, a lover of God, and I can see that you're a man of God. The Buddha looked at him and said, don't be stupid. There's no such thing as God. The poor man was shattered and went off down the road staggering. And then not far further down the road, another man came along, and he was a learned scholar. And when he saw the effulgence of the Buddha, he thought this was the light of wisdom around him. And he went over to the Buddha and he said, oh, isn't knowledge wonderful? We don't need a God because knowledge is supreme. The Buddha said, God? There's nothing else but God. foolish man. The poor man was shattered, went off down the road staggering. Further down the road, he meets another man. Now this man is a seeker, and he sees the effulgence of the Buddha. He goes up to him and he says, I'm a seeker after God, and I've been reading the books, and some books prove that God doesn't exist, and some books prove that God does exist. Tell me, does God exist? The Buddha remained completely silent, didn't say a word, and the poor man was shattered. Didn't have an answer to his question, staggered off down the road. So Ananda and the Buddha get to their place of rest for the night, and Ananda says, Master, I'm very troubled. First you say that there's no God, then you say that there's nothing else but God, and then you stay silent. What does it mean, Master? And the Buddha replied, the answers that were given were for those who ask the questions. But if my answers have troubled you, then that's your question. There's a story that said that Moses, when he went to the mountain, he was given, along with the words of the Torah, that there was a sword which would enable him to alleviate the suffering of his people. In other words, the world. And legend had it that that sword was buried in a mountain in Iraq, Kurdistan, in fact. Now there were 3 young men who were one of those who were terribly oppressed and suffering at that time, who decided that they were going to try to find this sword so that they could alleviate the suffering of their people. But where to look? They knew that it was on a mountain, and it was said that it was the mountains in the region where they lived. But how to find it? But they were determined, and they set out. And they asked everywhere they went. And of course people had heard of this sword, but nobody knew where it was. But they came to a certain village, and the person in charge of that village was a blind man who was embittered by his affliction. And he held on to power with as much tightness as he could. So when the young man asked the questions, this man thought that these young men were about making a plan to topple him from his place. So he made a plan. He got his servants to go out and bury an old rusty sword in the vicinity of their village. And then he told someone that they must tell these young men that this is where the sword was. And when they discovered the sword, which of course was in the old man's territory, they could be put to death because they were claiming something in his realm. Well, this was all set up, and to cut a long story short, the rusty sword was buried, the 3 young men were brought to the head man of the village, who accused them of stealing with the intent to overthrow him. But they were a bit astute, these young men, and one of them said, "Oh, no, we have no intention of rebelling or causing any usurpation of your place. But we think this sword is going to bring us wealth, and we're willing to share that wealth." "Oh," he said, "yes, I'll be in that." So he set the young men free to complete their quest, if they could. But, unbeknownst to the young men, he had them followed, of course. He didn't trust anybody, this old fellow. But off they went. And they came to 3 mountains. And they debated amongst themselves, where could this sword be buried? And then one amongst them said, well, Moses climbed the highest mountain, so we should too. So they did. They climbed up the top of the highest mountain of the 3. And when they got there, they found the opening to a cave. When they entered that cave, after lighting a torch to make their way, they followed a very narrow passageway, barely wide enough for them to make their way, until they came out into a large cavern. In the light of their torch, they could see that there was a stream running through the cave. And when they went over to the stream, there in the light of their torch was a golden fish. When they looked closely, to their very great surprise, on the back of the fish was the emblem of a sword. And on that sword was written letters which they recognized, but to their language seemed to be unpronounceable. Perhaps because they were all consonants, and that's a little clue. But they thought, this is a divine message. Could it be that the sword that they were looking for was not an actual sword, but a word? Unpronounceable though it was for the moment, but they watched the fish go off into the distance, into a crevice, and then they debated amongst themselves, how would we pronounce this word? And between them, somehow, they were able to come up with an enunciation. And when they did, an amazing thing happened. They found themselves back at the base of the mountain. Now, unbeknownst to them, those who had followed them had seen them go up the mountain. And being mountain men themselves, they knew that there was no way to descend down the other side, so they couldn't escape their view. So they just waited at the bottom. But how was it? How did they get there? They would have been seen if they'd taken the descent down the mountain. They had no other way to go. So the men knew that something miraculous had happened. But these 3 young men were now pursued by those who had followed them. So they quickly, as fast as they could, ascended the mountain again. But those who were following them were mountain people, like mountain goats. And they very quickly seemed to catch up with them. But standing on the crest of the mountain, the 3 young men spoke that word again. And an extraordinary thing happened. The mountain nearby came closer, so that they could step off the edge of one onto the other. And after it had done so, it returned to its place. Those who had pursued them firing their bows and arrows and their lances, which fell harmlessly into the valley below. The 3 young men knew, without a question of a doubt, that that which they had been seeking as a sword, an instrument that would enable them to free their people from oppression, was not a sword as such, but a word. And now, just to complete the little trilogy, I tell you the true story. Now, most of you know that I spent some years with a Japanese lady in Hawaii who we called the Divine Mother. But her story was encapsulated that she was given the power of Ramakrishna, the great universal teacher and saint of the 18th century. It came to her in the being of a messenger who came to her when she was in her 60s and told her that she'd been chosen. Now, after staying with her, this messenger gave her a word. And this word was to open the consciousnesses of all those who received what it brought forth. In sitting and being with her for those years, there was a direct experience and witnessing, and sitting beside her. When she spoke this word, I can confirm to you from my own experience that it was like someone switching on a blazing light. And that light radiated out and lit up the room, and from my witnessing, it brought forth all the rubbish. Because she used to say, when the light goes in, the rubbish comes out. Now, in telling these stories and making this confession to you, you have to make of it what you will. But perhaps when these words are said to you once again, when now effectively the God of the mind, the belief systems, have been erased, and it said, make God real. You can recognize how this can be done, and how, and what it will bring about. But if you're not here next week, I'll do one. Not good. And a drunken one at that.